Welcome to Revenge with Roman, where betrayal cuts deep, emotions run high, and justice is delivered in the most unexpected ways. Broken heart in today's story. My wife robbed me of my inheritance, but the revenge I delivered next left her shaking in pure fear. This isn't just a tale about money. It's about trust shattered, love turned to deceit, and a man pushed to the edge by the very person he vowed to share his life with. What begins as heartbreak quickly spirals into a storm of lies, greed, and calculated payback. Each twist pulls you deeper into the darkness, where one decision changes everything and the line between love and revenge blurs forever. Daniel had always believed that his father's legacy would not only be a reminder of the man who had raised him, but also a foundation to build a better future. His father had been a hard-working man, the kind who never wasted a penny, who believed in saving for tomorrow, and who instilled in Daniel the importance of resilience and family honor. When his father passed away, leaving behind a substantial inheritance, Daniel saw it as more than money. It was a bond of man he had lost, a final gift from a parent who had spent his life ensuring his son would have security even after he was gone. For weeks, Daniel found it difficult to even touch the funds, because in his mind, every dollar carried a weight of his father's love, sacrifice, and memory. It wasn't just wealth, it was something sacred. He remembered the countless times his father had spoken about how money could change people, how it revealed their true character rather than creating it. Daniel, his father would say, money isn't good or evil, it's just a mirror. It shows people as they really are. Those words came back to him with haunting clarity when he began to notice small inconsistencies in his financial records. At first, it seemed like nothing, just a transfer he couldn't recall, a receipt that didn't line up with his expectations. Daniel thought maybe he was miscalculating, still grieving, too distracted to focus. But something gnawed at him, a cold unease that refused to let go. Claire, his wife, had been unusually cheerful during those days. She carried herself with a new kind of confidence, speaking more often about plans for vacations, shopping trips, and social events. Daniel, blinded by love and trust, assumed she was simply trying to lift his spirits, to remind him that life could go on even after such a loss. He wanted to believe in her sincerity. She had held him through nights of grief, whispered words of comfort, promised that they would build a future together in honor of his father. He had leaned on her more than ever, grateful for the support she seemed to offer so selflessly. But behind that comforting exterior, Claire had been moving like a shadow. While Daniel mourned and tried to piece his life together, she had quietly accessed accounts, shifted funds, and drawn from what was never hers to take. Daniel would later piece together how methodical she had been, how she had studied his routines, waited until he was too lost in grief to notice, and then struck with precision. Every transfer was calculated, every lie disguised as kindness, and all the while, Daniel remained blind, convinced that the woman beside him shared the same sense of reverence for his father's memory. The moment of realization came one quiet evening as Daniel sat at his desk, going over some paperwork. He noticed a withdrawal for a large sum, one that couldn't be explained by bills or regular expenses. At first, his mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bank error, maybe something automatic he had forgotten about. But as he dug deeper, the evidence began to stack in ways that no longer allowed for excuses. There were multiple transactions, each growing bolder, each bleeding away the inheritance piece by piece. His chest tightened as the truth began to settle, heavy and merciless. Daniel's hands trembled when he confronted the possibility that it wasn't a stranger or an institution that had wronged him. The betrayal had come from within his own home. Memories of Claire's recent behavior began replaying in his mind. The new dresses, the sudden interest in high-end restaurants, the subtle ways she brushed off his concerns when he mentioned finances. What once seemed like innocent indulgences now looked like mocking displays of her hidden crime. She hadn't even bothered to hide her satisfaction. She was flaunting it right under his nose, confident he would never suspect. The inheritance wasn't just numbers on a screen to Daniel. It was his father's blood, sweat, and decades of sacrifice. It was a farm his father had sold to give his son opportunities, the businesses he had worked double shifts to sustain, the countless nights of exhaustion endured to build something lasting. And now, In the cruelest twist of fate, it had been stolen by the one person Daniel thought would guard his heart and legacy with him. The weight of betrayal was unlike anything he had ever known. It wasn't just about money. It was about trust, about love, about the vows they had spoken to each other when they promised to share a life built on honesty and loyalty. The room around Daniel blurred as anger surged through him, mingling with disbelief and sorrow. He pressed his palms to his eyes, trying to steady himself, but the storm inside was relentless. He had been foolish. He realized, foolish to think that grief would bring them closer, foolish to believe that love was enough to shield him from deceit. His father's words echoed again in his mind. Money is a mirror. And in that moment, Daniel saw Claire's reflection for what it truly was: greed, selfishness, and betrayal wrapped in the disguise of affection. Daniel's world tilted on its axis that night, leaving him with a truth so sharp it cut deeper than any blade. The woman he trusted most had not only robbed him of his inheritance, but had also desecrated the final bond he had with his father. It was a theft not just of wealth, but of dignity, of memory, of trust that could never be mended. Claire had always been skilled at hiding her true intentions behind a carefully crafted smile. To anyone else, she was a picture of a devoted wife, attentive, graceful, and endlessly supportive. But behind that facade, she had already begun weaving a web of deceit that Daniel never imagined he would be caught in. While he mourned his father, Claire saw opportunity. The inheritance was supposed to be their shared safety net, a resource for building a future together. Yet in her eyes, it became something entirely different, a golden ticket to the life she secretly craved. One free from the quiet simplicity Daniel had always preferred. The first transfer was small, almost invisible. Claire knew Daniel wasn't checking the accounts as carefully as before. His days were heavy with grief, his nights restless and distracted. He trusted her completely with their finances, and she took advantage of that trust without hesitation. What began as a cautious dip into the inheritance quickly spiraled into something bolder. Each time she succeeded without being caught, her confidence grew. She moved larger sums, telling herself she deserved it, that Daniel would never notice, or that if he did, she could spin a convincing story. What made her betrayal more insidious was the ease with which she lied to his face. When Daniel questioned the sudden arrival of new clothes in her wardrobe, she laughed softly, brushing it off as a seasonal sale she couldn't resist. When he noticed her checking her phone with unusual intensity, she told him it was just a friend from work. When she suggested they dine at more expensive restaurants, she disguised her indulgence as a way of treating him during his grief. Every deception was wrapped in words of affection, and Daniel, blinded by love, accepted them without suspicion. Claire's motivations weren't just about greed, they were about power. For years, she had quietly resented the way Daniel idolized his father. The old man's influence lingered in every decision Daniel made, every word of advice he repeated, every value he held tightly. To Claire, it was suffocating, a constant reminder that she would never truly have Daniel all to herself. Stealing the inheritance wasn't just about wealth. It was her way of breaking that tie, of asserting her dominance over the one piece of Daniel's life she couldn't control. With every dollar she transferred into her own account, she felt a thrill of victory, a sense of liberation from a shadow she could never escape. But Claire's greed was not invisible to the world around her. Friends began noticing her sudden shift in lifestyle. The woman who once preached modesty was now flashing designer bags, hosting extravagant dinners, and speaking of plans that far outstripped what Daniel's modest career could provide. She basked in the attention, mistaking whispered curiosity for admiration. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. Her arrogance blinded her to the fact that her lies, no matter how carefully spun, could never hold forever. Daniel, meanwhile, still fought with confusion. He couldn't quite place why something felt different about Claire. The woman who had once been his source of comfort now seemed more distant, her laughter hollow, her touch fleeting. He tried to push the unease aside, telling himself that grief was coloring his perspective, that maybe he was imagining the shift in her behavior. But the doubts kept growing, gnawing at him in the quiet moments when he sat alone, staring at the bank statements that didn't add up. Each stolen dollar was another nail in the coffin of their marriage, though Daniel didn't know it yet. Claire was building her empire on the ruins of his father's legacy, convinced she had outsmarted him, convinced that love made him too blind to ever question her loyalty. What she failed to realize was that the higher she climbed on the ladder of deceit, the further she would ever fall when the truth finally came crashing down. Daniel's doubts eventually drove him to a place he never thought he would go, scrutinizing the woman he had trusted with his life. The unease that had been eating at him for weeks reached a breaking point one evening when he sat down with a glass of whiskey and a stack of bank statements. His father's voice echoed in his mind, steady and clear. "Pay attention to the details, son. The truth is always in the details." And so, with trembling hands and a racing heart, he began to comb through every line, every transaction, determined to silence the storm inside him, or confirm it once and for all. At first, the numbers looked ordinary. Bills, grocery expenses, small purchases that made sense. But as he worked backward, digging deeper, Daniel's chest tightened. There were transfers he couldn't remember authorizing, withdrawals from accounts he hadn't touched. The figures weren't minor. They were substantial, and the dates lined up perfectly with moments when Claire had acted suspiciously cheerful or unusually generous. Each inconsistency became a thread, and when he tugged, an entire web unraveled before him. He dug further, searching through old receipts Claire had carelessly left behind in drawers and handbags. Designer stores, luxury items, dinners at upscale restaurants that Daniel had never attended. One receipt in particular made his stomach drop. It was for a necklace worth thousands, something Claire had never shown him. Rage surged through him as he realized she hadn't even bothered to share the spoils of her theft with him. She had been living another life, funded entirely by the inheritance that was meant to secure their future. But the most damning evidence came not from receipts or statements, but from Claire's own arrogance. One night, while she was showering, her phone buzzed on a nightstand. Daniel never believed in snooping, but something in him snapped. He picked it up and unlocked it. She had always said she had nothing to hide. What he found made his blood run cold. Messages to a close friend bragging about how easy it had been to move the money, how Daniel was too blinded by grief to ever notice. She even joked about how she could make him feel guilty for asking questions, turn his doubt back on him as if he were the unreasonable one. The betrayal sank into his bones like ice. His mind reeled as he read line after line, each message a dagger twisting deeper. Claire hadn't just stolen the inheritance. She had mocked him for trusting her. She saw his grief not as something to comfort, but as a weakness to exploit. Every kiss, every soft word of reassurance she had given him during those weeks had been a mask, hiding the smirk of a thief who thought herself untouchable. Daniel dropped the phone onto the bed, his hands shaking, his vision blurring with a mix of fury and heartbreak. The inheritance had been his father's last act of love, and Claire had gutted it without hesitation. But what cut deeper than the financial betrayal was the sheer cruelty of her deceit. She hadn't stumbled into temptation. She had planned it, executed it, and celebrated it. That night, Daniel sat in silence for hours, staring into the dark, his chest burning with an ache he couldn't put into words. The woman he had once called his partner, the one person he thought he could lean on, had reduced his father's legacy to a game of greed. And in her arrogance, she had left him with the proof he needed, proof that would one day become the very weapon he would wield against her. Claire's transformation was gradual, but to Daniel, once the truth was uncovered, every detail from the past few weeks snapped into place like jagged shards of glass forming a cruel picture. She no longer carried herself like the woman he had married, someone who once cherished simple evenings, hand-me-down furniture, and the warmth of shared laughter. Now she walked into every room with her head held higher, her voice carrying a sharper tone of authority, her smile dripping with a confidence that no longer felt like love. It felt like mockery. Daniel noticed how she flaunted her new wardrobe, silk dresses, designer handbags, heels that clicked against the wooden floor like a metronome of betrayal. She hadn't even tried to hide it. She wanted him to see, to question, so she could twist the knife deeper by feeding him lies. When she spoke of vacations to Paris or luxury getaways to tropical beaches, her eyes lit up with a hunger that unsettled Daniel. These weren't dreams shared between partners. These were demands, almost expectations, as though she had already decided what their future should look like, extravagant, indulgent, far beyond what Daniel ever valued. He had always been a man of moderation, grateful for stability, for the idea of saving for tomorrow. Claire's new fantasies were reckless, dripping with a scent of greed, and he now understood why. She was speaking from a place of ownership, not partnership, because she had already taken what wasn't hers. The most painful moments were the little ones, the casual conversations that, in hindsight, were lined with arrogance. Claire would toss her hair over her shoulder, wave off his concerns with a laugh, and assure him that everything was fine whenever he hesitated about their spending. She knew the money she had stolen gave her leverage, and Daniel, drowning in the rawness of grief, had believed her every word. Now, every one of those reassurances sounded hollow in his memory, echoes of a cruel game she played while he tried to heal. At family gatherings, the change in Claire became even more obvious. She leaned into her role as the doting wife, flashing smiles, showering Daniel with compliments in front of others, all while wearing jewelry he hadn't bought her and dresses that couldn't be explained by their income. Relatives whisper among themselves, some admiring her sudden glow-up, others raising eyebrows at how quickly she seemed to have moved past the mourning period. Daniel, meanwhile, stood at her side, his face a mask, hiding the storm within him. He was learning to observe her now, every gesture, every glance, every carefully chosen word. The woman who once blended seamlessly into his world now seemed like a stranger performing on a stage. The betrayal was amplified by the intimacy they once shared. At night, when she reached for him, he found himself recoiling internally, forcing his body to remain still while his heart screamed in silence. Every touch reminded him of the duplicity he had uncovered. Every kiss felt like a theft of his dignity. She slept soundly, unaware that her secrets were no longer safe, while Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind running to the evidence he had collected. He was no longer grieving just his father. He was grieving the marriage he thought he had, the love he believed was real. The anger that boiled within him wasn't wild or uncontrolled. It was cold, measured, and growing sharper with each passing day. He didn't lash out at her, didn't confront her immediately. Instead, he watched. He let her think she was untouchable, let her bask in the illusion of power she thought she had. The more she flaunted her stolen wealth, the more certain he became that she had underestimated him. Daniel's silence wasn't weakness. It was the sharpening of a blade. Claire's arrogance blinded her. She mistook Daniel's quiet demeanor for submission, believing she had broken him, that grief had left him too fragile to ever stand up to her. What she didn't know was that with every dress she bought, every dinner she paraded in front of him, every careless lie she told, she was fueling the fire inside him. Daniel wasn't just hurt anymore. He was calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The world saw a wife glowing with new wealth and a husband silently standing by her side. But beneath the surface, an invisible war was already being waged. And though Claire thought she had already won, Daniel knew the truth. Her victory was only temporary, and when his hand finally moved, it would be with precision sharp enough to leave her trembling. Daniel had always been a man of patience, the kind who thought carefully before making decisions, who preferred quiet observation over rash action. That trait, once a gentle strength instilled by his father, now became his most dangerous weapon. The night he confirmed Claire's betrayal, something inside him shifted. He didn't erupt in anger, didn't storm into the bedroom to demand answers. Instead, he sat in the dim light of his study, the inheritance statements and receipts scattered across the desk like pieces of a broken puzzle, and allowed his mind to harden around a single truth. Claire believed she had outsmarted him. She thought she had taken everything, and worse, she thought he was too blind, too broken by grief to ever notice. That arrogance would be her undoing. From that moment forward, Daniel played a role. By day, he was a grieving husband struggling to find his footing after his father's passing, leaning on Claire for support, accepting her smiles and reassurances with gnawed gratitude. He allowed her to think she was still in control. He let her plan dinners at expensive restaurants, let her parade her new possessions, even forced himself to laugh at her jokes when family and friends were around. To Claire, he was still the same trusting, docile husband she could manipulate with ease. To Daniel, it was all an act, a mask he wore while inside his chest a storm brewed with growing intensity. He began observing her patterns more closely. He noticed the time she checked her phone, the hours she spent away under the guise of errands, the subtle smirk that tugged at her lips when she thought he wasn't watching. He cataloged every detail, not out of paranoia anymore, but with intent. The more he watched, the more he realized that Claire's confidence made her sloppy. She left trails, receipts in her bags, messages half deleted but still recoverable, passwords carelessly saved on devices. Daniel began to quietly gather these fragments, storing them away like ammunition, knowing that when the time came, he would need undeniable proof to strike. The process of planning his revenge became almost therapeutic. For weeks, he had been drowning in grief, weighed down by betrayal, suffocated by the helplessness of being robbed not only of money, but of love and trust. But now, with each piece of evidence he uncovered, he felt a strange clarity return. He was no longer a man broken. He was a man sharpening himself into something dangerous. Every evening after Claire drifted off to sleep, he stayed awake, writing notes, tracing transactions, contacting old family friends who had experience in law and finance. His father's teachings came back to him with startling force. Lessons about resilience, patience, and the importance of striking only when the time was right. The temptation to confront her burned in him, especially when she smiled across the dinner table as if nothing had happened. But Daniel knew anger would only give her an advantage. If he showed his hand too early, she would twist the story, paint herself as a victim, and possibly even escape with what she had stolen. No, he thought, his revenge had to be precise, undeniable, and most of all, devastating. He wanted her to feel the weight of fear, the crushing collapse of her carefully constructed lies. He wanted her to tremble, not just for what she had done, but for ever believing he was weak enough to be fooled. In moments when the weight of betrayal threatened to overwhelm him, Daniel reminded himself of the bigger picture. Claire hadn't just stolen money. She had desecrated his father's final gift, turned something sacred into fuel for her greed. His revenge then wasn't just personal. It was justice, both for himself and for the man who had worked tirelessly to secure that inheritance. Every step he took in his plan felt like honoring his father, ensuring that the legacy Claire tried to destroy would instead become the very thing that destroyed her. Daniel also began to distance himself emotionally, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. He stopped confiding in her, stopped reaching for her comfort. Instead, he practiced silence, learned to smile without warmth, nod without agreement. He became a mirror, reflecting back the illusion she expected to see, while inside, he was already 3 steps ahead. She thought she was a puppeteer pulling strings, but Daniel was already cutting the threads one by one, waiting for the moment when the entire performance would collapse. His friends noticed subtle changes in him too. Though he still carried grief in his eyes, there was now something else, an edge, a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. Some thought he was healing, finding his footing again after his father's death. Only Daniel knew the truth. It wasn't healing. It was preparation. Every betrayal, every smug glance, every stolen dollar added fuel to fire inside him. And as he laid out his plan in the stillness of the night, Daniel promised himself one thing. When the time came, Claire would not just face exposure. She would face fear unlike anything she had ever known. Daniel knew that planning alone wouldn't be enough. He needed leverage that could not be dismissed or twisted. His father's inheritance had been stolen, yes, but to ensure justice, he needed someone with knowledge of the law, someone who would transform his meticulous research into a tool that would corner Claire completely. He reached out to an old friend of his father's, Mr. Harrison, a sharp-minded attorney with decades of experience in family law and financial disputes. Harrison had always treated Daniel like a son, and Daniel knew he could trust him implicitly. Over quiet lunch in a small, inconspicuous cafe, Daniel laid out the situation in precise detail. He spoke calmly, almost coldly, recounting every transaction, every suspicious message, every receipt he had uncovered. Harrison listened, nodding slowly, the lines of concern etched into his face deepening with each revelation. "It's worse than I thought," Harrison said finally, after Daniel had finished. "She's been systematic, and she thinks she's untouchable. But with the right approach, we can make sure she never forgets what she's done." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded, feeling the weight of possibilities settle in his chest. They spent hours reviewing the evidence, tracing the flow of money, connecting each suspicious transfer to Claire's actions. Harrison showed Daniel how to compile everything into an airtight legal case, one that would leave no room for excuses or manipulations. Daniel's meticulous notes, paired with Harrison's expertise, transformed a personal betrayal into a weapon that could not be ignored. But legal strategy alone was not enough. Daniel wanted Claire to feel the weight of her actions emotionally as well as financially. He began to devise a trap, a situation where her arrogance would lead her straight into the spotlight of exposure. It had to be something she couldn't anticipate, something orchestrated with precision, so that she would be unable to manipulate her way out. Every detail of her personality, every predictable response she had shown in past interactions, was taken into account. Daniel imagined scenarios in which she would react with overconfidence, believing she was in control, only to find herself ensnared by her own hubris. At the same time, Daniel practiced his own demeanor, crafting the perfect balance of calm and authority. He could not appear angry or suspicious. Claire had to believe he was still the husband she had manipulated so effortlessly. He rehearsed conversations, predicted her deflections, and prepared subtle cues that would guide her into the trap without her realizing it. Every step was measured. Every word was deliberate. He became both a shadow and a conductor, orchestrating a symphony of justice that was yet to be heard. Even when Claire bragged about her new purchases or flaunted her supposed victory, Daniel remained composed. He smiled when necessary, nodded when expected, and hid the storm that raged beneath the surface. To her, he was still the grieving, trusting husband. To Daniel, she was a pawn in a game she didn't even know she was playing. He collected her missteps, saved her careless messages, and ensured that each piece of evidence could be presented publicly if needed, leaving her no path to escape responsibility. In quiet moments, Daniel revisited betrayal again, letting the memory sharpen his resolve. The trust he had placed in Claire, the love he had given her, had been twisted and exploited. That memory became fuel, driving him to ensure that the exposure would not be subtle, not quiet, not forgettable. She had mocked his grief, laughed at his blindness, and celebrated a crime she thought would go undetected. Daniel vowed that her reckoning would be undeniable, leaving her trembling not just from fear of legal consequences, but from the realization that she had misjudged him entirely. As the trap began to take shape, Daniel felt a mix of anticipation and calm that surprised even him. Every detail was falling into place. Claire's routines, her overconfidence, her public display of wealth, all were aligning to make her eventual downfall inevitable. And yet, Daniel remained patient. He had learned from his father that timing was everything. Strike too early, and the moment would be wasted. Wait too long, and the opportunity might slip. He had found the balance, and now all that remained was to execute with precision. With Harrison's guidance, Daniel reviewed every legal loophole Claire might attempt to exploit. They prepared documents, contracts, and evidence packages. Every email, every bank statement, every whispered boast would be used against her at the exact right moment. Daniel felt a strange satisfaction, not from revenge itself, but from the meticulous order he was bringing to chaos. He was reclaiming control, taking back what had been stolen, and preparing to demonstrate that betrayal, no matter how cleverly disguised, could never go unpunished. Claire had grown so accustomed to assuming she was untouchable that she never noticed the subtle changes around her home, the quiet tension that Daniel had cultivated over weeks. She moved through their lives as if on a stage, performing confidence, flaunting her ill-gotten gains, and smiling at a husband she believed was still under her spell. That night, Daniel had arranged a dinner, a casual gathering in appearance, with a few trusted friends and family members invited under the guise of celebrating life after his father's passing. The house was immaculate, the table set elegantly, the lighting warm and inviting. Every detail had been meticulously arranged to draw Claire in, to encourage her to reveal herself, to step fully into the trap he had prepared. She entered the room radiant, dressed in a gown that shimmered under the chandelier's light, carrying the same self-assured aura that had so unnerved Daniel in recent weeks. She didn't suspect a thing. Every smile she offered, every flirtatious glance, was intended to reinforce her sense of triumph. Daniel met her at the door, his expression calm, his posture relaxed. He smiled, holding her hand briefly, masking the storm of calculation that raged within. Claire interpreted it as affection, her own ego swelling at the thought that she had him completely fooled. As the evening progressed, Daniel guided the conversation with subtle precision, introducing topics that seemed casual but were carefully designed to provoke slips, to elicit reactions that could be observed and recorded. He spoke of family finances, of long-term plans, and lightly touched on inheritance in ways that seemed almost offhand, knowing that Claire's arrogance would compel her to respond. And respond she did, casually, too casually, with jokes about having it all and veiled boasts about independence and financial cleverness. To any outsider, her words might have sounded like harmless banter, but Daniel's trained eye caught every nuance, every hint of guilt, every sign of overconfidence. Daniel had also arranged for discreet recordings, both audio and video, ensuring that no manipulation could escape scrutiny. Claire, in her certainty, didn't even notice the small devices hidden in the corners, the subtle positioning of family members and friends who were in on the plan. They laughed at her jokes, nodded at her stories, all while observing the cracks forming in her facade. She walked into this trap thinking it was just another ordinary evening, another stage for her performance, unaware that the stage had been built specifically to expose her. The subtlety of the setup was crucial. Daniel did not confront her directly. He allowed her to speak, to brag, to reveal the depth of her arrogance. Every word she uttered, every gesture she made, became evidence, a puzzle piece falling perfectly into place. Daniel felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and anticipation as he watched her, quiet and composed, while she strutted confidently into the very space where her undoing had been meticulously crafted. Even her interactions with guests were part of the unfolding trap. She teased, she laughed, she boasted about her spending, each action and word recorded and noted. She believed she was charming, that everyone was on her side, that Daniel was still the man under her control. Little did she know, he had orchestrated every detail with precision. Every glance from a family member, every knowing smile, every subtle gesture from friends in the room, all reinforced the carefully controlled environment that would soon corner her completely. By the time the dinner reached its midpoint, Claire's confidence was at its peak. She believed the night was hers to command, a performance in which she would shine, flaunting her victories and enjoying the envy of those around her. But Daniel remained composed, silent, patient. He let her dominate the evening, speak without restraint, and unknowingly provide the proof he needed. Her ego had blinded her to the reality that she was no longer in a game she could control. She was a player moving exactly where he wanted her, toward a reveal she could neither escape nor manipulate. Daniel's heart remained steady, though his mind raced with anticipation. He knew every reaction, every slip, and every boast was building the foundation for the confrontation to come. The trap had been set, every detail accounted for, every outcome considered. Claire, in her hubris, had walked straight into the carefully orchestrated snare, believing she was untouchable, unaware that the next moments would strip away her confidence, her arrogance, and leave her trembling in the aftermath. The moment Daniel had been waiting for arrived with a calm he had cultivated over weeks of careful planning. Claire, still radiant in her confidence, had no idea that every boast, every careless word, every subtle sign of arrogance she displayed that evening was meticulously documented. Daniel stood from his seat at the table, his movements slow and deliberate, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. The air shifted instantly. Claire's eyes followed him, puzzled at first, then narrowing slightly as she realized he was about to speak. The quiet in the room grew heavier, the subtle hum of expectation settling over the guests as Daniel reached into the briefcase at his side and pulled out a carefully organized folder. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he let the weight of silence press upon the room, letting the anticipation grow. Claire shifted slightly, the confidence in her posture faltering ever so subtly. She smiled nervously, thinking perhaps he was about to toast her, to continue the facade of marital harmony. But Daniel's eyes, calm and piercing, held a promise of truth, of exposure. He began methodically, laying out evidence piece by piece. Bank statements, transaction logs, receipts, and digital messages. Everything she had tried so carefully to conceal now spread before the eyes of family and friends. Each piece was a blow to the illusion she had so meticulously constructed. As Daniel spoke, he narrated the evidence with controlled intensity, highlighting not just the transactions themselves but the pattern of deceit, the intentional manipulation, and the arrogance that had guided her actions. These statements, he said, his voice steady, show withdrawals and transfers that were unauthorized. Every expense, every luxury, every indulgence traces directly back to your actions. And these messages, he continued, holding up the printed text, prove that you not only took what wasn't yours, but celebrated it while mocking me behind my back. Claire's smile faltered, then vanished entirely. Her eyes widened as the realization dawned, the carefully crafted facade of control slipping like sand through her fingers. She opened her mouth to speak, to deny, to argue, but no words came. The room was silent, all eyes on her, as the weight of the evidence pressed down. Friends and family shifted uncomfortably, sensing the gravity of what was unfolding. They had seen hints before, her sudden lifestyle changes, the extravagances. But Daniel's methodical presentation left no room for doubt. The proof was undeniable. She tried to reach for an excuse, to claim misunderstanding, to twist a narrative, but Daniel anticipated every move. His calm demeanor, his precise timing, and the sheer weight of documentation left her grasping at thin air. Every defensive gesture, every attempted justification, only reinforced the reality that she had been exposed. The woman who had once seemed untouchable, whose arrogance had blinded her to consequences, now faced the undeniable truth in front of those who mattered most. The tremor in her hands began subtly at first, a nervous flicker as she realized that nothing she could say would change the evidence laid bare before her. The confidence that had carried her through weeks of manipulation crumbled under the scrutiny of undeniable fact. She had flaunted her victory, believed herself cleverer than everyone around her, and now the entire house bore witness to the truth. Each glance from a family member, each shocked expression from friends, drove home the depth of her miscalculation. Daniel's own emotions remained carefully controlled, a blend of satisfaction and restrained anger. He allowed the revelation to unfold naturally, letting Claire feel the weight of her choices in real time. He didn't need to shout, to accuse, or to rage. Every paper, every message, every documented transaction was a voice louder than any outburst. And with each second, he watched as her certainty shattered, the very foundation of her arrogance collapsing under the brilliance of preparation and patience. The evening stretched on, each moment amplifying the tension. Claire's eyes darted between the documents and the faces surrounding her, searching for a lifeline that didn't exist. The room, once warm with casual conversation and laughter, now hummed with quiet disbelief and tension. Everyone could see it. The exposure was complete, and Claire was cornered. Her plans, her manipulation, and her stolen gains were all laid bare, leaving her not only humiliated but utterly vulnerable. Daniel observed her carefully, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the quick intake of breath, the trembling of her hands. This was the moment he had envisioned, crafted with patience, fueled by betrayal and sharpened by precision. Every ounce of deceit, every ounce of arrogance had led to this very instant. The undeniable confrontation where truth prevailed and Claire was forced to face the full scope of her actions. The room was thick with tension as Claire's facade finally began to crumble. Her once confident posture wavered, her head tilted slightly as if searching for a lifeline that wasn't there. The smugness that had defined her for weeks, months, even, was gone, replaced by something far more fragile. Panic. Every carefully rehearsed lie, every boastful remark, every smirk she had flashed while flaunting her stolen inheritance now felt exposed under the relentless clarity of Daniel's evidence. The house that had once been a stage for her performance now felt like a cage, and she was trapped in the spotlight of her own deceit. Daniel's calm, deliberate presence intensified the effect. He didn't need to raise his voice, to yell, or to accuse further. Every page he had laid out, every photograph, every transaction, every text message he displayed had already spoken louder than any words could. Claire's friends and family, silent witnesses to the exposure, now leaned forward, their expressions a mixture of shock, disbelief, and understanding. They saw not just the financial betrayal, but the emotional cruelty, the meticulous way she had manipulated Daniel while mocking his grief. The betrayal cut deeper than money ever could, and it was laid bare for all to see. Her hands began to tremble slightly at first, subtle but impossible to miss. She gripped the edge of the table, knuckles whitening, eyes darting around the room as if searching for a path to escape the truth she had ignored for so long. Every attempt to form words fell flat. Her voice caught in her throat as the reality of the situation finally hit her. She had overestimated her control, overestimated Daniel's vulnerability, and now the very people she thought she had deceived were witnesses to her downfall. The arrogance that had once been her armor dissolved with each passing second. She tried to force a laugh, an excuse, a diversion, anything to regain composure, but it was futile. Daniel had planned meticulously, anticipated every reaction, and prepared for every attempt at manipulation. Nothing she could do now would alter the undeniable proof of her betrayal. The confidence she had wielded like a weapon now became her undoing, and the realization struck her with a cold, paralyzing force. Claire's breathing grew shallow, rapid, almost frantic, betraying the storm of panic building within her. Her eyes, which had once sparkled with arrogance, now flickered with fear and regret. Every glance around the room reflected the weight of judgment, the silent condemnation of those who had watched her carefully curated lies crumble. She felt exposed, humiliated, and powerless, a sensation she had never experienced, one she had never imagined for herself. Daniel watched her carefully, noting every trembling hand, every faltering word, every sign of internal collapse. He remained composed, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp, reflecting the satisfaction of a plan executed with precision. He didn't gloat, didn't mock. He allowed the evidence and the collective understanding of those around her to do the work. The power she had wielded so confidently was now reversed, and she was forced to confront the magnitude of her miscalculations. The weight of reality pressed down on Claire, and the full impact of her actions began to resonate. She had stolen not only wealth but trust, love, and the memory of Daniel's father. And now, stripped of pretense, she realized that every indulgence, every lie, every act of manipulation had led her to this exact moment of humiliation and exposure. Her trembling intensified, spreading from her hands to her entire body, as though the gravity of her betrayal was physically manifesting. Friends and family exchanged glances, recognizing the shift in her demeanor. What had been a confident, commanding presence was now a shadow of its former self, vulnerable and broken. Claire's arrogance, once a shield, had become brittle and fractured under the weight of truth. Each piece of evidence Daniel had presented, each calculated move he had made, compounded her fear and shattered her sense of invincibility. The realization hit her fully. She had underestimated Daniel in every possible way. She had assumed grief and love would render him weak, that he would remain blind, that she could manipulate the situation indefinitely. But she had misjudged his patience, his intelligence, and his capacity for strategy. The very man she believed she controlled now held the power completely, orchestrating her downfall with precision and inevitability. Claire's collapse was as much emotional as it was psychological. Her hand continued to shake, her breathing uneven, her gaze darting hopelessly around the room. For the first time, she felt the consequences of her actions not as abstract threats, but as immediate, inescapable reality. Every lie, every stolen dollar, every moment of mockery was coming home to roost, leaving her trembling under the weight of exposure, powerless to alter what had already been set into motion. Daniel felt the quiet satisfaction of inevitability settle over him as he observed Claire's collapse. The trembling hands, the hollow eyes, the shallow breaths. Every sign confirmed that the truth had fully shattered her carefully constructed world. But he didn't rush. He let the moment linger, allowing her to sit with the weight of what she had done, to feel the fear that came from knowing every manipulation, every lie, and every stolen dollar had been exposed beyond any possibility of escape. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the subtle rustle of papers Daniel had laid out, the physical evidence of her betrayal. He rose slowly, each movement deliberate, his gaze fixed on Claire. She flinched slightly, as if sensing that the calm, composed man before her carried more authority now than he ever had before. Daniel didn't speak immediately. He wanted her to feel the gravity of the moment, the full magnitude of her defeat. When he finally did, his voice was steady, precise, and cold in its control. Everything you've done has been documented. Every attempt to manipulate me, every indulgence purchase of money that wasn't yours, every lie you told. There is no escaping it. Claire's lips parted, but no words came. Her arrogance had crumbled completely, leaving her vulnerable and exposed. The confident smirk that once defined her now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by panic and disbelief. She had underestimated Daniel's patience, his intelligence, and his resolve, and now the consequences of that misjudgment were inescapable. Every attempt to justify herself faltered. There was nowhere to hide, no way to turn the situation in her favor. Daniel reached for the final documents, legal contracts, signed affidavits, and evidence compiled with the precision of weeks of planning. "These," he said, spreading them across the table, "are not accusations. They are facts. And facts, Claire, cannot be ignored." His calm authority was overwhelming, leaving no room for argument. The documents represented not only the stolen inheritance, but also the betrayal of trust, the desecration of family legacy, and the manipulation of someone who had loved her blindly. Her hands trembled violently now, a reflection of the fear coursing through her entire body. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in as Daniel methodically walked her through the evidence. Each point he made reinforced the inevitability of her downfall, each document displayed confirming the depth of her deceit. She had been so confident, so certain that she could control the outcome, and now she was confronted with the full, undeniable weight of her actions. Friends and family looked on, some in silent shock, others with a sense of justice being served. They had watched her arrogance, her manipulation, her blatant flaunting of wealth, and now they were witnessing the complete reversal of power. Claire had thought she was untouchable, but Daniel had orchestrated every detail, ensuring that the truth could no longer be denied or distorted. Her pride, once impenetrable, had been reduced to trembling vulnerability. Daniel didn't gloat, didn't mock. His revenge was not about cruelty. It was about justice, precision, and reclaiming what had been stolen. The inheritance was restored, but more importantly, so was his dignity, his sense of agency, and the sanctity of his father's legacy. Claire's fear was a natural consequence of her choices, a mirror reflecting back the arrogance and greed that had driven her to betray him. As the evening progressed, Daniel allowed Claire to absorb the full impact of what had transpired. Each fleeting attempt to speak, to explain, to deny, only emphasized her helplessness. Every document, every piece of proof, every witness present reinforced reality she could no longer escape. She had been so certain, so self-assured, and now the terror in her eyes revealed the true cost of underestimating the man she had betrayed. For Daniel, there was a quiet triumph and restraint. He had not lashed out in anger. He had not sought vengeance in haste. Instead, he had used patience, intelligence, and meticulous planning to deliver a reckoning that was thorough and undeniable. In reclaiming his father's inheritance and exposing Claire's deceit, he had also reclaimed control over his life and future. The betrayal that had once seemed insurmountable was now a closed chapter, a lesson etched into memory, leaving only the satisfaction of justice served. The room remained hushed, the tension palpable, as Daniel finally allowed himself to exhale. The storm of betrayal had passed, leaving clarity and balance in its wake. Claire's trembling hands and haunted expression were the final affirmation that the reckoning was complete, and that Daniel's patience, strategy, and resolve had achieved what mere anger never could: total and undeniable justice.